Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, February 26th, 2022, and today we're going to be taking a look at the state of Texas, which holds its first 2022 primary. Holding off that runoffs don't occur, but they probably will, knowing the state of Texas. Their first primaries will be held on March 1st, 2022. And this starts as the first state in the nation to actually begin their political primaries. These primaries come in a very early wave, and ones that are nowhere near what other states put forth when it comes down to their political primaries. If you take a look at a bunch of other states, some of them won't even have their Democratic or Republican nominees until about mid-August. So to see Texas so early on the line means that there is a lot at stake here for both political parties, considering that it is the second most populous state in the nation, but also means that it is really hard to gauge how the 2022 election will end up based off of a very early primary. You see, looking at a lot of this data and looking at the turnout, there really isn't much of an expectation for this to be high turnout because you really aren't seeing the full campaign fully fledged out through this election cycle, and yet the primaries are occurring so early on. Becomes a bit more difficult to see how this can predict the outcome of the 2022 midterms, but we will take it as is. And the reason why I'm covering it is because, again, it does serve as our first true test about Democratic Party turnout and Republican Party turnout, in addition to just the competitive nature of some of these House districts that have been recently redrawn. The state of Texas did their redistricting process in which they have finalized on this congressional map, in which the Democratic Party is solidified in many districts, the Republicans are solidified in about double those amount of districts. There are only a few competitive districts by presidential vote share, not by House vote share, because what you will find is that these previously drawn districts in the older map actually ended up going to the Democratic Party by a bit higher of an amount. But what you will find is that there are two districts, one right here, the Texas 28th District, which went to this incumbent by, I believe, 19 points in 2020 under an older map that actually had the district at Democrat +4. So keep in mind we're referring to the presidential margin. And then a new open seat, meaning they have drawn an additional seat because of the census adding an additional 2 seats in the state of Texas. You have an additional seat here, the 15th, that is an even partisan lean, and then barely a competitive race in the 23rd District with a partisan lean of Republican +13. So the only true competitive races for 2022 are in this southern region across the state of Texas. What you will find is that these districts were much less Republican or, have been somewhat solidified up, but they have been positioned in a way to give the Republican Party the ability to at least win 2 out of the 3 or potentially 3 out of the 3. But that's not the only thing we're worrying about here. What we are looking at are 2 polls as well that have come from the state of Texas that reveal who is in the front-running type of race for the state of Texas. On the Republican side, what do you have? You, of course, have Greg Abbott, who is the incumbent here, who is running for a 3rd term, who is up 50 points in the Republican primary. I don't think that is really shocking anyone. For the Democratic side, you have Beto O'Rourke, who is also completely demolishing his opponents. Now, Beto O'Rourke is doing better than Greg Abbott is. Abbott is in the state of Texas in the Republican primary, mainly because the former chairman of the Texas Republican Party is running against him. But that is really just a pipe dream. At the end of the day, Greg Abbott is going to win this Republican nomination for governor, and Beto O'Rourke is as well. But Vox actually points out this individual competitive race, one that I showed you, the Texas 28th District, where there is a progressive challenger challenging the Democratic incumbent here. And while we won't talk about that much here because this is a discussion of the statewide primary and all of the primaries altogether, I think this might, after the election results, deserve a little bit more individual representation and individual attention, simply because that will actually tell us something about the midterms. I don't want to waste our time talking about it right now if we are going to get the results in literally 5 days from now. But what we are finding is that they are looking at many of these states as a means of showing us how the rest of the nation will go and how Latino voters in specific are going to go in the state of Texas. And they talk about, the mirroring of, the progressive versus, liberal ideology in the Democratic primary, talking about whether or not Democratic incumbents can continue to be primary the same way that we saw it happen with AOC back in 2018. What we are seeing here is a lot of signs, whether on the Democratic Party, whether on the national level, whether on a turnout level, whatever it might be, this Texas primary is going to tell us a significant amount. Now, Do Texas primaries actually end up predicting the outcome of general elections? Not necessarily. In the state of Texas in 2014, Greg Abbott defeated Wendy Davis by over 20 percentage points. In the Republican primary, there were 1.3 million Republican Party voters. It was a red wave, and Democrats only had 500,000 voters. So, in a sense, you could see this as, yes, the Democratic Party did not necessarily have as much turnout by far. What you found was that the Democrats were severely lacking when it came down to turnout, and thus they lost the general election. But in 2018, the same exact thing occurred. And you could say, right, the regular election went to Greg Abbott by a margin of 13 points. This really isn't, showing anything different than the last one. Democrats didn't turn out at the same level, but keep in mind what was happening on the national level in the state, in the 2018 midterm environment. The Democratic Party was doing extremely well, and they did extremely well, despite the fact that the Republican Party received 1.5 million Republican primary turnout votes compared to the Democratic Party at 1 million, meaning there was a significant increase relative to 2014, but then again, there were just more residents in the state of Texas, also more Democratic Party voters, but it wasn't really a determining factor in terms of, what we saw happen in the general election. I would also say that in the Senate election, this is something that was a pretty big deal. Beto O'Rourke nearly won the 2018 Texas Senate election against Ted Cruz. Only lost by a margin of 2.6% across the state, meaning there were voters who voted for Trump in 2016, voted for O'Rourke in 2018, and then voted for Trump again in 2020. But looking at the primary results, what you found was that Ted Cruz, in his primary, won 1.3 million votes. That's more than even the amount of people that voted in the Democratic primary. So it wasn't necessarily an indication that, anything. It was just more so that the individual election ended up with different results. So for 2022, I don't think we should look at turnout as a means of a baseline about, this ultimately means the Republican Party is ahead, this ultimately means the Democratic Party is ahead. But what it does tell us is a better idea about who's inspired to turn out. In 2018, you saw about a doubling of the 2014 turnout, which does mean that there was at least some more interest. I do think that is fair, especially considering our national environment. It didn't predict the outcome of the general election. I don't think that was the reason or even a determining factor as to, this is how we should expect the race to go, because Democrats saw equal turnout in the governor's election and the Senate election, but saw a 10-point difference when it came down to the loss in that state. But I will look at it as a means of just looking for enthusiasm, but it isn't, the end of the story. It won't be the sole determining factor about the outcome of the election, and probably will be one of the least consequential. What I do think that it will tell us is, generally speaking, in these individual primaries, whether or not progressives are the future of the Democratic Party or not. And I know we've been in this discussion since 2016, when Bernie Sanders nearly defeated Hillary Clinton in a bunch of states and then ultimately ended up losing by about 10 points nationwide. So definitely kept Hillary Clinton down to her margin, certainly gave her a run for her money. And Bernie Sanders really inspired a significant portion of the population, inspired a significant portion of progressives in the Democratic primary party to primary their Democratic incumbents. And sometimes it fails and sometimes it works, right? Sometimes it is a method that works correctly. In Michigan's 5th congressional district, not the 1st district, Cori Bush actually primaried the Democratic nominee there, Democratic incumbent there, and ended up in Congress. She ended up winning 79% of the vote. So what you are finding is that Democrats have primaried successfully in the past and won, and that will tell us about the direction and the future of the Democratic Party, specifically in the state of Texas, based off of these results. Because we do have a primary coming up on March 1st in the state of Texas, and with our newly drawn lines, I'm excited to see what the results will be. Now, I will caution this by saying that in many of these districts, no matter who the Democratic Party puts up, they will either lose or they will win handedly. That is just the deal. The fact that there are only two competitive seats in the state of Texas right now means that we will be really just reaching based off of these two individual districts that will really set the tone for the state of Texas. For instance, if I was to go to Texas's 30th district and I was to run as a progressive leftist and I was to defeat the incumbent there, would that win of a margin of 51 points be a testament to progressive electability versus centrist electability? And not to say that this incumbent isn't. This is just a, random example. But is that a testament to that? Probably not. Probably not in the least bit. If I was a progressive to run in Texas's 19th district and to defeat a long-lasting line of centrist Democrats running in that district and I lost by 53 points, is that a testament to progressive unelectability or not? Probably not. It only is truly testable in many of these competitive seats, and some people from the 2020 election point out that progressives that took stances on Medicare for all won all of their elections. Well, I would say that in many of those races, they were predetermined to win, and in some of them, they did actually underperform Joe Biden. In some cases, they did outperform Joe Biden, and I think it is a mixed bag, but there never is a concrete answer, which is why it will be interesting to see what happens from the state of Texas. If progressives end up holding on to races that would otherwise be losable, for instance, then that raises some concerns, for progressives. It raises some concerns that maybe they shouldn't be, the top ticket people when it comes down to competitive House seats. Looking at the fact that, keep in mind, this 28th district here, the incumbent Democrat won by nearly 20 percentage points. Joe Biden only won this district by 4 points in 2020. So you're talking about a 15-point overreach. And what you're finding here is that they, on the progressive left, want to primary this incumbent. Is that going to do the Democratic Party justice? Knowing this incumbent has a 15-point upper hand on Joe Biden, is that really the way you want to go down? And there could be an argument, and there probably is, that there is the possibility that a progressive could actually make this district more left-leaning. Who knows? Right? That this Democrat incumbent could still win over all of those voters that voted for Democrats in 2020, because at the end of the day, they were voting for Democratic idealism, and that Democrat will also bring that with them, just probably a much more left-wing view of it. And that's where it gets tricky. So Texas's primary probably isn't going to tell us much about the national environment. Knowing the 2014 and 2018 results, it really wasn't a determining factor about the outcome of the general election. Turnout does measure enthusiasm, but also sometimes it can be wrong, as it was in Texas in 2018. I mean, looking at the margin of votes that Ted Cruz defeated Beto O'Rourke in, he won more primary votes than Beto O'Rourke did in 2018 than he won in the general election. That margin between primaries was more significant than it was in the general election in an extremely partisan state, when the Texas Republican primary wasn't even contested. So that's when it really comes into concern. I think at the end of the day, that we should look at Texas as a means of telling us individual statewide politics, and more so the progressive versus centrist type of argument. Beyond that, there really isn't much else to see. There aren't that many competitive races when it comes down to the state of Texas anymore. The governor's race probably isn't going to be super competitive, considering that Greg Abbott is up by about 9 points statewide. Beto O'Rourke definitely could narrow it down, and I have no expectation that he wouldn't. I think that Beto O'Rourke definitely will bring it to a point where it is a 9-point victory for Greg Abbott, but that's still a 9-point victory. And at the end of the day, that primary really was inconsequential entirely. Beto O'Rourke definitely has a political future ahead of him. I don't know if that's in the House. I don't know if that's in the Senate. I think Texas needs to get bluer before he wins. He is the right type of candidate, though, I think, for the Democratic Party to run and have build a grassroots, run and lose as a sacrificial lamb, but in a way building up the Democratic Party's energy, building up the Democratic Party's ability to win in the future. And I think that's what we've seen so far when it comes down to Stacey Abrams in Georgia, or other Democrats that are aiming to do a very similar thing, where they know they are going to lose this race, but later down the line, because they ran in this race, because they built the ground game, because they built the network, because they canvassed, the Democrats could win in the future. I don't know if Beto O'Rourke is playing the long game or not, but this primary is practically just a formality. We know who the nominees are going to be for governor. There is no Senate race here. The last one was Ted Cruz in 2018 and John Cornyn in 2020, so that one won't be up. There won't be a Texas Senate race until 2014, when Ted Cruz returns to the ballot, either as the presidential nominee or the Senate nominee for Texas, or potentially not at all. I think, what we are going to see is pretty much just a more so internal division between the Democratic Party, but nothing major statewide. I don't think there is any super close races to watch. I think in the state of Texas, what we are going to find is that maybe the Attorney General's race might be interesting to see on the Republican side. Maybe it'll tell us something a little interesting about what's going to happen nationwide when it comes down to Trump-endorsed candidates versus not. But truly speaking, I don't think it's going to be the most really consequential or helpful thing to understand as we move through the future. There is so many more states that have yet to hold their primaries. I mean, Texas literally is going to be the first in the nation, and it's the second most populous state. This is such a large primary, and yet it really isn't going to get the attention it deserves because it's being held so early on. And I don't think that it will receive as much analysis and discussion as otherwise might be considered. I think, looking at the state of Texas, there is going to be potentially in the future, a very competitive trend for the state. It went from 2014, 2012 in the presidential election, going to Romney by 16, to the 2020 election of going to Trump by 6. 16-6 is a dramatic trend. 8 years from down the line, 2028, who knows? It might be a Democrat plus 5 state. That just seems to be the trajectory that Texas is going in. But there is a possibility that Latino voters walk back on the Democratic Party and reverse all of the progress that the Democratic Party has done in the state of Texas. And that could happen potentially if a progressive defeats this Democratic incumbent, or if this Democratic incumbent defeats the progressive, and Democrats really have nothing to put forth in terms of policy, in terms of fighting for legislation, things along those lines. It'll just be maintaining the status quo. And right now, based off of our national numbers and based off the Texas numbers, it doesn't look like the status quo is helpful for the Democratic Party. So a lot to unpack, a lot to see. It'll truly be a determining factor for the November election when it comes down to the electability of progressives versus centrists. But for the rest of these Texas races, we really aren't seeing much. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.